I'll take it away. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a scholar in residence in the finance division at CU Boulder. One of the verticals in my research stream surrounds digital governance. Given that I only have 5 minutes, I'll only talk about the digital governance research of mine that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about, which is to say MetaGov actually sponsored a piece of mine entitled Governance as Conflict, Constituting Shared Values or a Shared Purpose as Defining the Future Margins of Disagreement. In that piece, I spell out the many ways in which the act of constituting an organization in furtherance of an agreed upon purpose creates conflict. And organization designers need to confront that head on in order for their organization to be resilient. There's also more general kind of rational interest critiques of the concept of a shared purpose as animating any particular organization, which is to say people are there for diverse reasons and their motives vary considerably in terms of the reasons that they're at the table. So you take those two critiques pretty seriously, and it's like, this is an artifice. There is no animating purpose for an organization other than the weird union of things or reasons that people come to the table. To me, I now want to take the flip side, which is to say, actually, there's very good reasons for organization designers to spend a lot of time thinking about shared purpose. And so notwithstanding the critiques that I've made elsewhere in print, as well as the more general public choice critique of organizations writ large as never being animated by a singular purpose, to me, all the way back at the organization design stage, an animating purpose is really important. And there's two ways in which an animating purpose can be reified into an organization's constitution or first collective choice rules if it's a private organization. So I'm not just talking about public sector governments that have a big C constitution that's formally named as such. I'm also talking about charters. I'm also talking about the initial protocol chosen by a DAO. That is a constitutive set of choices in furtherance of a particular purpose. In many instances, notwithstanding an ultimate goal of a highly decentralized autonomous organization, the organization starts out with a relatively small group of designers. To me, that isn't at odds with purpose. The desire to progressively decentralize is trading off between highly specialized knowledge, highly concentrated intrinsic motivations and extrinsic motivations, which is to say the people starting a DAO expect to benefit potentially from the scaling and the increases in membership of that DAO. And they might believe fundamentally in the need for a different path. And so one of the first and most important things to do is to articulate a shared vision animating the organization in the first instance. The second question immediately becomes, how do you create or animate that purpose through your constitutive design choices and protocol? To the extent that you can, you should do so. To me, that's integral. If you want to protect human rights, the first action that you should engage in is probably articulating the set of human rights that you consider to be most important for your governance system to protect. But what about the rest of the purpose? Protocol is inevitably incomplete, just as all other institutions are in the face of the complexity of human behavior and the non-ergodicity of the world. So do you just leave that up for grabs? My contention is no, which is to say there's a set of things that are operationalizable in protocol. They're implementable and definable in constitutional language as something that an executive and a judiciary can implement and subsequently enforce and interpret.
1 minute warning.
1 minute, awesome. The other component is principles, a statement of a preamble. We were motivated to come here today to do this thing, and this is what's animating us. These are the problems we see in the world that are leading us to define this new organization. Is that just flowery language? I don't think so. Which is to say that in future periods, How many politicians say, oh, these principles animating our nation are not well chosen. We need to get rid of one of them. Even if it's a principle that is not operationalizable in law, you never see that happen. Instead, politicians choose the principles most consistent with their objectives and their vision for a better state as they understand it within the system. So even the non-operationalizable principles prove to have a Schelling Point coordination effect in terms of downstream actors. They tend to square their objectives within those articulated principles, however unoperationalizable those are in first instances. But that means organization designers, including those starting DAOs, should take the time to spell out their motives. This is what brought us together. This is the gap we see us as solving. These are the principles that we all agree upon, even though we can't encode those into rigid delimitation of the action space of individuals on this network. This is something I've been thinking about in practice considerably lately because I'm helping Zargam and others constitute a data trust. And a big question is, which fiduciary duties does the data trust articulate as being binding under law as applying to itself versus the more general design choice of saying, this is what we're intending to do, and these are the interests of data contributors that we're trying to represent faithfully according to these principles. I leave us with that example because that might potentially provide fruitful kind of a concrete example for us to discuss in the ensuing discussion. Sorry for going over time.
No, going over the allocated time was by design, since we are a bit more flexible today with the time limitation, but that's very thought-provoking. Thanks a lot to Eric. The floor is now open for contributions and discussions on his presentation. So feel free to send comments in the chat or unmute yourself and comment on that chat.
If I may chip in.
Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so your presentation was great, but it had a lot of terminology in it. It was quite dense. The gist of what I understood was something similar to a TED Talk, focus on the why. So make sure that you not only focus on the how and the what, but you just focus on the principles and the vision, to have a shared vision before that. But in order to understand better your talk, would you be able to give us an example on what you would recommend a DAO to do in order to be more successful?
Take very seriously the fuzzy act of defining a shared mission, animating purpose, a vision, you name whatever that soft thing is. I think protocol design is like the kind of apex of institutional design, which is to say, by definition, you're trying to achieve something with a particular network. So you're delimiting the action space of people on that network in furtherance of an animating purpose. Therefore, the very act of protocol design lends itself to a focus on the operationalizable principles in furtherance of an animating purpose. But my argument is DAO designers should not leave to the side the more fuzzy act of this is what animates us. This is our vision. These are our shared values as we understand them in this moment. To the extent there's agreement about that. You shouldn't flog shared values out of nowhere that don't actually represent the vast majority of people at the startup stage. But to the extent there's relatively uniform agreement, there is value in both the operationalizable components of purpose being designed very carefully in furtherance of that animating purpose. But the less obvious thing, for me at least, that I see is there is discrete value in producing documentation that can never be encoded in protocol, which is to say, this is what animates us. This is the problem we're trying to solve. And these are the values that we see as suffusing this animating purpose for our organization. Think about the importance of many of Vitalik Buterin's thoughts on decentralization, on vision for the network in future stages. At least when he's writing them, the vast majority of those thoughts are not operationalizable into protocol, but they shape downstream debates within the community in really important ways, probably in ways that Nathan Schneider can speak about at much greater detail than I can. But there's this dual component of the purpose, which is the stuff that's easily implementable, that should go in the Constitution, that should be defined in protocol, if you're taking my analogy. But what about the preamble saying, this is why we're here, this is what unites us, these are our values? To me, there's a downside to that, and I've written elsewhere about why that's an oddly reifying notion. This is taking the flip perspective and saying, why then do we tend to see the proliferation of things like preambles, the extensive discussion of vision and mission for startups? It's that it's playing a Schelling Point coordinative role for people in downstream periods. So you try to constrain the messy action space in a non-ergodic world of all the complexity of human behavior. One way you do that is through protocol. It is through constitutionalizing specific institutional prescriptions and proscriptions. But if you're just doing that, you're missing this other component of purpose, which nonetheless constrains actors in future periods in ways that are consistent, ideally, with the intent of organization designers in the first instance. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. I think there's a question in the chat. Seth asked a question. You could read that. Short of being encoded in protocol, how can technology serve the development of statement of shared values, beliefs, and purpose? Seth, do you want to elaborate that?
So here we are building tools, and what tools do you imagine if we're off chain? Is it just plain text and good old Roberts rules, or small working groups, or is there a role for technology in these other important dimensions of culture building or organization building?
So I think that there is an upper limit to which technology can surface purpose itself, absent a sufficiently shared level of purpose among human individuals. But at a minimum, I think transparency, especially in the formative stages for organizations that announce an intent to be democratic, an argument Nathan and I have been having in a side channel, is the extent to which democracy is a good word. I prefer representative governance, but in systems that are like, we want representative governance, either for normative reasons or for functional reasons, we think this organization will do better with more representative governance. At a minimum, what's awesome about technology is it facilitates a credible commitment to transparency. And so transparency in the early phases to a sufficient level is really important, not total transparency. There are good reasons that, say, Zargam and I should be having good faith discussions about the extent to which fiduciary duties the data trust voluntarily assumes. We can speak freely in a context that we know we're not being recorded. We can make statements that later are revealed to be not compliant with governing law. And so we need a private space to discuss, but past a certain point of definition, my contention is organization designers should commit to a certain level of ex-ante transparency. And so a variety of digital tools are really cool for ensuring transparency of discussions once they've reached a certain level of development. more specifically, there are contexts, and I see this as kind of like, how do we surface purpose from many different Discord channels and many different Reddit forums? I've been doing work in very different contexts with computational text analysis techniques. I could potentially see something interesting where it's like, we don't even have a community, it's just all these Reddit channels. And it's like, yeah, no one person could really synthesize that effectively in the time where it would be valuable to do so. Throw a topic model at it and see what words surface with regularity. And if it's across platforms, but they're all dedicated to the same DAO, that could potentially be revelatory of, hey, these are things that clearly are cared about among many atomistic members of this community at a non-trivial level. But to me, the general lesson is transparency in this process from the get-go is facilitated by technology in really interesting ways. And I use the MetaGov DAO grant example just to emphasize the weird margins by which transparency proliferates in these types of communities, which is the stewards of the MetaGov DAO may remember I blew through my self-imposed deadline like the academic that I am. Yet I didn't move my grant payment out of my wallet. And had I had perverse incentives, how would it have looked if the day the money landed, I threw that payment into a mixer and tumbler and no one knew where it went after that? And then I blew through my deadline without announcing it to the community. And how inclined am I to behave in that bad way, given how transparent the payment mechanisms for the system are, as well as the fact that my identity is also known to the community because of the transparency of the proposal process, which is, don't think it would have been a good look or dynamically consistent with my incentives in the broader digital governance community to just take the money and run from MetaGov, be like, they had no incentive, they had no punishment embedded. I'm just teaching them a costly lesson. Indeed, I'm doing the community a favor. I think everyone would be like, that dude sucks and should not get more digital governance funding in any project we're involved with. And so to me, that's just an example of how the ways in which transparency is embedded into these systems can actually align incentives in important ways. And I think transparency at the design stage in terms of articulating and animating purpose. And I see some of Nathan's work with the shared document for this community that I was in good faith trying to say, we should be careful in terms of understanding how and when a document becomes representative of community values. And it's in part my lessons from studying animating purpose that is saying that's not encoded in protocol anywhere, but that thing will eventually get legs in various ways, but providing a sort of notice and comment period is part of the process of transparency that we can embed, even if it isn't enshrined in protocol, so to speak.
We have about 1.5 minutes to conclude the discussion session. So, sorry for interrupting.
Well, maybe one more comment or one more question to Eric. Eric, listening to your concepts, don't you think it might make sense that before putting the DAO rules, the governance on chain, to just start with the values, the principles, then go to the more detailed governance rules, and then put it on chain? So to start off chain, do everything off chain, go from the principles and the values to the more detailed rules, and only later on put it on chain?
Completely agree with your order of operations. And I think we might actually surface certain animating purposes that, given the order you've noted, it will become clear that it's not very operationalizable, or that the form of governance that predominates on DAOs may not be that tractable to the animating purpose in the first instance. And in particular, that's something we're struggling with our data trust, which is it's meant to be serving a collective bargaining role, which is the very problem with the current status quo of data, the uses of consumer data online is no one of us can bargain with Facebook. No one of us can bargain with Twitter. And so actually an animating purpose for a data fiduciary is one that requires some measure of centralized governance because of the inefficiencies of every single person bargaining for the relatively atomistic value of their own data. And so for us, purpose comes first, and then optimal governance structure, how to operationalize that animating purpose immediately follows from a chosen purpose. The way I put this to my students is there's upper constraints on what any organization can do in furtherance of its own purpose. It's a much harder organization to achieve when you're saying, we're selling hamburgers and we're making every customer more enlightened at the same time. That's a very different business model than we're selling the cheapest hamburgers of a sufficient quality in this geographic area. One we know how to do really well. The other one is a very, very hard purpose. Not to say you shouldn't take it on, but I'm probably over time. Obviously, Sent asked me this morning, do you want a long talk? And I was like, on short notice, I can give you a long talk, and it will be one of the most discursive, rambling stream of consciousness spews you've ever seen. And rant.
Maybe we should just wait and come back around to this in a few months and do a full talk describing the specific details of the challenges that we faced and what we've learned from them.
Awesome.